Chapter 3. There was the faintest sliver of a moon low over the horizon as they started out across the black sand of the wasteland in the biting chill. Garion felt distinctly uncomfortable in the role Silk had thrust upon him. He knew that there had been no need for it, since they all knew where they were going and what they had to do. If any kind of leadership had actually been required, Silk himself was the logical one to provide it, but instead the little man had placed the burden squarely on Garion's shoulders and now seemed to be watching intently to see how he would handle it. There was no time for leadership or even discussion when, shortly after midnight, they ran into a party of Murgos. There were 6 of them, and they came galloping over a low ridge to the south and blundered directly into the middle of Garion's party. Beric and Mandaralin reacted with that instant violence of trained warriors, their swords whistling out of their sheaths to crunch with steely, ringing sounds into the mail-skirted bodies of the startled Murgos. Even as Garion struggled to draw his own sword, he saw one of the black-robed intruders tumble limply out of his saddle, while another, howling with pain and surprise, toppled slowly backward, clutching at his chest. There was a confusion of shouts and shrill screams from terrified horses as the men fought in the darkness. One frightened Murgo wheeled his mount to flee, but Garion, without even thinking, pulled his horse in front of him, sword raised to strike. The desperate Murgo made a frantic swing with his own weapon, but Garion easily parried the badly aimed swipe and flicked his blade lightly, whip-like, across the Murgo's shoulder. There was a satisfying crunch as the sharp edge bit into the Murgo's mail shirt. Garion deftly parried another clumsy swing and whipped his blade again, slashing the Murgo across the face. All the instruction he had received from his friends seemed to click together into a single, unified style that was part Cherik, part Arendish, part Algar, and was distinctly Garion's own. This style balked the frightened Murgo, and his efforts became more desperate. But each time he swung, Garion easily parried and instantly countered with those light, flickering slashes that inevitably drew blood. Garion felt a surging exultation boiling in his veins as he fought, and there was a fiery taste in his mouth. Then Relg darted in out of the shadows, jerked the Murgo off balance, and drove his hook-pointed knife up under the man's ribs. The Murgo doubled over sharply, shuddered, then fell dead from his saddle. "What did you do that for?" Garion demanded without thinking. "That was my Murgo!" Beric, surveying the carnage, laughed, his sudden mirth startling in the darkness. "He's turning savage on us, isn't he?" "His skill is noteworthy, however," Mandaralin replied approvingly. Garion's spirit soared. He looked around eagerly for someone else to fight, but the Murgos were all dead. "Were they alone?" he demanded, somewhat out of breath. "I mean, were there any others coming along behind them? Maybe we should go look." "We do want them to find our trail, after all," Silk reminded him. "It's up to you, of course, Garion, but if we exterminate all the Murgos in the area, there won't be anyone left to report our direction back to Rockthal, will there?" "Oh," Garion said, feeling a little sheepish. "I forgot about that." "You have to keep the grand plan in view, Garion, and not lose sight of it during these little side adventures." "Maybe I got carried away." "A good leader can't afford to do that." "All right," Garion began to feel embarrassed. "I just wanted to be sure you understood, that's all." Garion didn't answer, but he began to see what it was about Silk that irritated Belgarath so much. Leadership was enough of a burden without these continuous comments from the weasel-faced little man to complicate things. "Are you all right?" Taba was saying to Relg with a strange note of concern in her voice. The Ilgo was still on his knees beside the body of the Murgo he had killed. "Leave me alone," he told her harshly. "Don't be stupid. Are you hurt? Let me see." "Don't touch me!" He cringed away from her outstretched hand. "Belgarion, make her get away from me." Garion groaned inwardly. "What's the trouble now?" he asked. "I killed this man," Relg replied. "There are certain things I have to do, certain prayers, purifications. She's interfering." Garion resisted an impulse to swear. "Please, Taba," he said as calmly as he could. "Just leave him alone." "I just wanted to see if he was all right," Taba answered a bit petulantly. "I wasn't hurting him." She had an odd look on her face that Garion could not begin to understand. As she stared at the kneeling Olgo, a curious little smile flickered across her lips. Without warning, she reached her hand out toward him. Relg shrank back. "No!" he gasped. Taba chuckled, a throaty, wicked little sound, and walked away, humming softly to herself. After Relg had performed his ritual of purification over the dead Murgo's body, they remounted and rode on. The sliver of moon stood high overhead in the chill sky, casting a pale light down on the black sands, and Garion looked about constantly as he rode, trying to pick out any possible dangers lurking ahead. He glanced frequently at Aunt Paul, wishing that she were not so completely cut off from him, but she seemed to be totally absorbed in maintaining her shield of will. She rode with Erend pulled closely against her, and her eyes were distant, unfathomable. Garion looked hopefully at Belgarath, but the old man, though he looked up from his doze at times, seemed largely unaware of his surroundings. Garion sighed, and his eyes resumed their nervous scrutiny of the trail ahead. They rode on through the tag end of night, in the biting chill with the faint moonlight about them and the stars glittering like points of ice in the sky above. Suddenly, Garion heard a roaring in his mind, a sound that had a peculiar echo to it, and the shield of force surrounding Aunt Paul shimmered with an ugly orange glow. He jerked his will in sharply and gestured with a single word. He had no idea what word he used, but it seemed to work. Like a horse blundering into a covey of feeding birds, his will scattered the concerted attack on Aunt Paul and Erend. There had been more than one mind involved in the attack. He sensed that, but it seemed to make no difference. He caught a momentary flicker of chagrin and even fear as the joined wills of Aunt Paul's attackers broke and fled from him. "Not bad," the voice in his mind observed. "A little clumsy, perhaps, but not bad at all." "It is the first time I ever did it," Garion replied. "I'll get better with more practice." "Don't get overconfident," the voice advised dryly, and then it was gone. He was growing stronger, there was no doubt about that. The ease with which he had dispersed the combined wills of that group of Grollems Aunt Paul had called the Hierarchs amazed him. He faintly began to understand what Aunt Paul and Belgarath meant in their use of the word talent. There seemed to be some kind of capacity, a limit beyond which most sorcerers could not go. Garion realized with a certain surprise that he was already stronger than men who had been practicing this art for centuries, and that he was only beginning to touch the edges of his talent. The thought of what he might eventually be able to do was more than a little frightening. It did, however, make him feel somewhat more secure. He straightened in his saddle and rode a bit more confidently. Perhaps leadership wasn't so bad after all. It took some getting used to, but once you knew what you were doing, it didn't seem all that hard. The next attack came as the eastern horizon had begun to grow pale behind them. Aunt Paul, her horse, and the little boy all seemed to vanish as absolute blackness engulfed them. Garion struck back instantly, and he added a contemptuous little twist to it, a stinging slap at the joined minds that had mounted the attack. He felt a glow of self-satisfaction at the surprise and pain in the minds as they flinched back from his quick counterblow. There was a glimpse, just a momentary one, of 9 very old men in black robes seated around a table in a room somewhere. One of the walls of the room had a large crack in it, and part of the ceiling had collapsed as a result of the earthquake that had convulsed Rakthal. 8 of the evil old men looked surprised and frightened. The 9th one had fainted. The darkness surrounding Aunt Paul disappeared. "What are they doing?" Silk asked him. "They're trying to break through Aunt Paul's shield," Garion replied. "I gave them something to think about." He felt a little smug about it. Silk looked at him, his eyes narrowed shrewdly. "Don't overdo things, Garion," he advised. "Somebody had to do something," Garion protested. "That's usually the way it works. All I'm saying is that you shouldn't lose your perspective." The broken wall of peaks that marked the western edge of the wasteland was clearly visible as light began to creep up the eastern sky. "How far would you say it is?" Garion asked Dernick. The smith squinted at the mountains ahead. 2 or 3 leagues at least, he judged. Distances are deceiving in this kind of light. "Well," Barrack asked, "do we take cover for the day here, or do we make a run for it?" Garion thought about that. "Are we going to change direction as soon as we get to the mountains?" he asked Mandaralin. "It would seem better, mayhap, to continue our present course for some little distance first," the knight replied thoughtfully. "A natural boundary such as that which lies beyond might attract more than passing scrutiny." "That's a good point," Silk agreed. Garion scratched his cheek, noticing that his whiskers had begun to sprout again. "Maybe we should stop here, then," he suggested. "We could start out again when the sun goes down, get up in the mountains a ways, and then rest. When the sun comes up tomorrow morning, we can change our route. That way we'll have light enough to see any tracks we leave and cover them up." "Seems like a good plan," Varric approved. "Let's do it that way, then," Garion decided. They sought out another ridge and another ravine, and once again concealed it with their tent canvas. Although he was tired, Garion was reluctant to lose himself in sleep. Not only did the cares of leadership press heavily on him, but he also felt apprehensive about the possibility of an attack by the hierarchs coming while he was asleep. As the others began to unroll their blankets, he walked about rather aimlessly, stopping to look at Aunt Paul, who sat with her back against a large rock, holding the sleeping Errand and looking as distant as the moon behind her shimmering shield. Garion sighed and went on down to the mouth of the ravine, where Dernick was attending to the horses. It had occurred to him that all their lives depended on the well-being of their mounts, and that gave him something else to worry about. "How are they?" he asked Dernick as he approached. "They're bearing up fairly well," Dernick replied. "They've come a long way, though, and it's beginning to show on some of them." "Is there anything we can do for them?" "A week's rest in a good pasture, perhaps," Dernick answered with a wry smile. Garion laughed. "I think we could all use a week's rest in a good pasture." "You've really grown, Garion," Dernick observed as he lifted another horse's hind hoof to examine it for cuts or bruises. Garion glanced at his arm and saw that his wrist stuck an inch or two out of his sleeve. "Most of my clothes still fit, pretty much," he replied. "That's not the way I meant," Dernick hesitated. "What's it like, Garion, being able to do things the way you do?" "It scares me, Dernick," Garion admitted quietly. "I didn't really want any of this, but it didn't give me any choice." "You mustn't let it frighten you, you know," Dernick said, carefully lowering the horse's hoof. "It's part of you. It's part of you just like being tall or having blonde hair." "It's not really like that, Dernick. Being tall or having blonde hair doesn't hurt anybody. This can." Dernick looked out at the long shadows of the ridge stretching away from the newly risen sun. "You just have to learn to be careful with it, that's all. When I was about your age, I found out that I was much stronger than the other young men in our village, probably because I was working in the smithy. I didn't want to hurt anybody, so I wouldn't wrestle with my friends. One of them thought I was a coward because of that, and he pushed me around for about 6 months until I finally lost my temper." "Did you fight him?" Dernick nodded. "It wasn't really much of a contest. After it was over, he realized that I wasn't a coward after all. We even got to be good friends again, after his bones all healed up and he got used to the missing teeth." Garion grinned at him, and Dernick smiled back a bit ruefully. "I was ashamed of myself afterward, of course." Garion felt very close to this plain, solid man. Dernick was his oldest friend, somebody he could always count on. "What I'm trying to say, Garion," Dernick continued seriously, "is that you can't go through life being afraid of what you are. If you do that, sooner or later somebody will come along who'll misunderstand, and you'll have to do something to show him that it's not him you're afraid of. When it goes that far, it's usually much worse for you, and for him too." "As it was with Asherak?" Dernick nodded. "It's always best in the long run to be what you are. It isn't proper to behave as if you were more, but it isn't good to behave as if you were less either. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?" "The whole problem seems to be finding out just exactly what you are, really," Garion observed. Dernick smiled again. "That's the part that gets most of us in trouble at times," he agreed. Suddenly, the smile fell away from his face and he gasped. Then he fell writhing to the ground, clutching at his stomach. "Dernick!" Garion cried. "What's wrong?" But Dernick could not answer. His face was ashen and contorted with agony as he twisted in the dirt. Garion felt a strange, alien presence, and he understood instantly. Thwarted in their attempts to kill Errand, the hierarchs were directing their attacks at the others in the hope of forcing Aunt Paul to drop her shield. A terrible rage boiled up in him. His blood seemed to burn, and a fierce cry came to his lips. Calmly. It was the voice within his mind again. "What do I do?" "Get out into the sunlight." Garion did not understand that, but he ran out past the horses into the pale morning light. "Put yourself into your shadow." He looked down at the shadow stretching out on the ground in front of him, and obeyed the voice. He wasn't sure exactly how he did it, but he poured his will and his awareness into the shadow. Now, follow the trail of their thought back to them, quickly. Garion felt himself suddenly flying, and closed in his shadow. He touched the still writhing Dernick, once like a sniffing hound, picked up the direction of the concerted thought that had felled his friend, and then flashed through the air, back over the miles of wasteland toward the wreckage of Rakthal. He had, it seemed, no weight, and there was an odd purplish cast to everything he saw. He felt his immensity as he entered the room with the cracked wall, where the 9 black-robed old men sat, trying with the concerted power of their minds to kill Dernick. Their eyes were all focused on a huge ruby, nearly the size of a man's head, which lay flickering in the center of the table around which they sat. The slanting rays of the morning sun had distorted and enlarged Garion's shadow, and he filled one corner of the room, bending slightly so that he could fit under the ceiling. "Stop!" he roared at the evil old men. "Leave Dernick alone!" They flinched back from his sudden apparition, and he could feel the thought they were directing at Dernick through the stone on the table falter and began to fall apart. He took a threatening step and saw them cringe away from him in the purple light that half clouded his vision. Then one of the old men, very thin with a long dirty beard and completely hairless scalp, seemed to recover from his momentary fright. "Stand firm!" he snapped at the others. "Keep the thought on the sendar!" "Leave him alone!" Garion shouted at them. "Who says so?" the thin old man drawled insultingly. "I do." "And just who are you?" "I am Belgarion. Leave my friends alone." The old man laughed, and his laugh was as chilling as Two Chicks had been. "Actually, you're only Belgarion's shadow," he corrected. "We know the trick of the shadow. You can talk and bluster and threaten, but that's all you can do. You're just a powerless shade, Belgarion." "Leave us alone." "And what will you do if we don't?" The old man's face was filled with contemptuous amusement. "Is he right?" Garion demanded of the voice within his mind. "Perhaps, perhaps not," the voice replied. "A few men have been able to go beyond the limitation. You won't know unless you try." Despite his dreadful anger, Garion did not want to kill any of them. "Ice!" he said, focusing on the idea of cold and lashing out with his will. It felt odd, almost tenuous, as if it had no substance behind it, and the roaring was hollow and puny sounding. The bald old man sneered and waggled his beard insultingly. Garion ground his insubstantial teeth and drew himself in with dreadful concentration. "Burn!" he said then, driving his will. There was a flicker, and then a sudden flash. The force of Garion's will burst forth, directed not at the bald man himself, but rather at his whiskers. The hierarch jumped up and stumbled back with a hoarse exclamation, trying desperately to beat the flames out of his beard. The concerted thought of the hierarch shattered as the rest of them scrambled to their feet in terrified astonishment. Grimly, Garion gathered his swelling will and began to lay about him with his immensely long arms. He tumbled the hierarchs around the rough stone floor and slammed them into walls. Squealing with fright, they scurried this way and that, trying to escape, but he methodically reached out and grasped them one by one to administer his chastisement. With a peculiar kind of detachment, he even stuffed one of them headfirst into the crack in the wall, pushing quite firmly until only a pair of wriggling feet were sticking out. Then, when it was done, he turned back to the bald hierarch, who had finally managed to beat the last of the fire out of his beard. "It's impossible! Impossible!" the hierarch protested, his face stunned. "How did you do it?" "I told you. I am Belgarion. I can do things you can't even imagine." "The jewel," the voice told him. "They're using the jewel to focus their attacks. Destroy it." "How?" "It can only hold so much. Look." Garion suddenly found that he could actually see into the interior of the still flickering ruby on the table. He saw the minute stress lines within its crystalline structure, and then he understood. He turned his will on it, and poured all his anger into it. The stone blazed with light and began to pulsate as the force within it swelled. Then, with a sharp detonation, the stone exploded into fragments. "No!" the bald hierarch wailed. "You idiot! That stone was irreplaceable!" "Listen to me, old man," Garion said in an awful voice. "You will leave us alone. You will not pursue us or try to injure any of us any more." He reached out with his shadowy hand and slid it directly into the bald man's chest. He could feel the heart flutter like a terrified bird, and the lungs falter as the hierarch's breath stopped and he gaped with horror at the arm sticking out of his chest. Garion slowly opened his fingers very wide. "Do you understand me?" he demanded. The hierarch gurgled and tried to take hold of the arm, but his fingers found nothing to grasp. "Do you understand me?" Garion repeated, and suddenly clenched his fist. The hierarch screamed. "Are you going to leave us alone?" "Please, Belgarion, no more! I'm dying!" "Are you going to leave us alone?" Garion demanded again. "Yes, yes! Anything, but please stop, I beg you! I'll do anything, please!" Garion unclenched his fist and drew his hand out of the hierarch's heaving chest. He held it up, claw-like, directly in front of the old man's face. "Look at this and remember it," he said in a dreadfully quiet voice. "Next time I'll reach into your chest and pull your heart out." The hierarch shrank back, his eyes filled with horror as he stared at the awful hand. "I promise you," he stammered. "I promise." "Your life depends on it," Garion told him, then turned and flashed back across the empty miles towards his friends. Quite suddenly he was standing at the mouth of the ravine, staring down at his shadow slowly reforming on the ground before him. The purple haze was gone. Strangely enough, he didn't even feel tired. Dernick drew in a shuddering breath and struggled to rise. Garion turned quickly and ran back to his friend. "Are you all right?" he asked, taking hold of the smith's arm. "It was like a knife twisting inside me," Dernick replied in a shaking voice. "What was it?" "The Grolm hierarchs were trying to kill you," Garion told him. Dernick looked around, his eyes frightened. "Don't worry, Dernick. They won't do it again." Garion helped him to his feet, and together they went back into the ravine. Aunt Paul was looking directly at him as he approached her. Her eyes were penetrating. "You're growing up very fast," she said to him. "I had to do something," he replied. "What happened to your shield?" "It doesn't seem to be necessary anymore." "Not bad," Belgarath said. The old man was sitting up. He looked weak and drawn, but his eyes were alert. "Some of it was a bit exotic, but on the whole it wasn't bad at all. The business with the hand was just a little overdone, though." I wanted to be sure he understood that I meant what I was saying. Garion felt a tremendous wave of relief at his grandfather's return to consciousness. "I think you convinced him," Belgarath said dryly. "Is there anything to eat nearby?" he asked Aunt Paul. "Are you all right now, grandfather?" Garion asked him. "Aside from being as weak as a fresh-hatched baby chick and as hungry as a she-wolf with 9 puppies, I'm just fine," Belgarath replied. "I could really use something to eat, Bulgara." "I'll see what I can find, father," she told him, turning to the packs. "I don't know that you need to bother cooking it," he added. The little boy had been looking curiously at Garion, his wide blue eyes serious and slightly puzzled. Quite suddenly he laughed. Smiling, he looked into Garion's face. "Belgarion," he said.